Hello and welcome to Radical Engagements here at Varnblog. And today we are talking about the Lyon theses by Bordiga, but really we're going through the International Communist Party's introduction. We've gone through an IMT discussion of the same thing. We've talked about Bordigism in general, a la David Broder, and we've gone through the 1970 introduction from the ICP's edition of the Lyon thesis. But now we're going to go through the 2000 introduction. Still 24 years old, but a little bit closer to our time. We have seen the RCP's take, and I pointed out some things that I think are problematic in it, but I also pointed out some things where I think they're right. So we're going to continue that today, and then we're actually going to get into the thesis, which I consider where Bordigism really gets its definition, or the left faction in Italian communism really gets its definition. Although, again, it diverges in the Dement Bordiga arguments later. Anyway. Okay. According to this introduction, at the end of the speech lasting 7 hours, the left representatives at the Lyon Congress addressed Gramsci and declared that we don't have the right to call ourselves Marxist or even historical materialist just because we accept as a party bag and baggage certain theses relating to particular aspects, whether union activity, economics, parliamentary tactics, or the questions related to religion and culture. Only when we believe that the same conception of the universe and of history and of mankind's role within it can we properly be said to be standing on the same political banner. I just want to point out that this is larger for them than just tactical or even programmatic questions. If they believe that statement as said, they believe that metaphysical unity is required. Okay. Gramsci replied by acknowledging the correctness of the fundamental conclusion enunciated by the left, quote, and indeed admitted that at that moment he saw an important truth for the first time. To tell the truth, during the previous year's polemics with the left, even Gramsci's group had asserted that Leninism was a complete vision of the world and not just of the world revolution. Probably they said this without understanding it, though. Indeed, the left had no difficulty highlighting the contradiction between the assertion and fact that the leaders of the Ordine Nouveau subscribed to an idealist philosophy, that is, the conception of the world, which is characterized not of Marx and Lenin, but of neo-Hegelians, and particularly of Benito Croce. Where was the consensus in Gramsci subscribing to Croce in the philosophical manners and to Leninism for a worldview? Well, Leninism isn't a coherent worldview because it shifts, and you guys don't agree with Lenin. Lenin corrected you actively, and they particularly don't agree with later Lenin. I think if you look at the work of Eric von Rie, the Lenin of 1919 to 1921 is not as distant from what they're critiquing as the Bordigists would like. Okay, anyway. The revolutionary communist movement is based on a theoretical system which reflects an organic conception of the world. There's a lot of use of organic rhetoric in Bordigism. I think we're going to see this more often. We can actually see a hardening of the sectarianism between the 1970 and 2000 introduction already. The Marxist doctrine of historical and dialectical materialism, two words that were not actually used by Marx or Engels and were forced upon them by later editors and really have to go to Datsun, and were conceptualized and formalized by Bordiga's enemies. But nonetheless, which had found one of the most powerful champions in Lenin. Yeah, this is rhetorical flourishes. Get this some substance. This is why we give the name of doctrine to the complete theoretical scientific corpus. Yeah, you're trying to freeze the theoretical scientific corpus. Doctrine to the completed theoretical scientific corpus, as if the theoretical scientific corpus was completed by your assertions and your understanding of Lenin in 1916 to 1921. And why we were always jealously defended against every type of contamination or enrichment, some would say, from other schools of thought. Yeah, so you see yourself as a intellectual remnant vanguard. That works out so well for people. To call this doctrine Leninism is therefore entirely superfluous, as Lenin himself would have never thought it necessary. If Lenin had been a revisionist, see Eric Van Rie's work in ways in which Lenin did revise Marx, then we could justify the use of the term. But instead, he fought a fierce battle against revisionists of every stamp, and including you. What did he say at the party congress again? And challenged their right to adopt the Marxist name and Marxist tradition. He defended Marxist orthodoxy, something that everyone claims and no one can fucking define, including here. Drawing upon material from living history and with formal exegesis from the work of the founders of scientific socialism, he dissected the collaborating evidence provided by history, capital, but in support of our common doctrine down to the very last detail. We can see here the rhetoric of the Bordigists moving from the partisan for themselves to outright freezing and even using religious language explicitly to defend a scientific theoretical corpus, including selective capitalization. History is capitalized like God. Come the fuck on. I thought Trotskyists were bad about this shit. Or Marxist-Leninists, for that matter. The battle conducted by Marx, Lenin, and the Italians, of course, the corpus that we like, and exempting the fact where they disagreed with each other, because you cannot actually look at that. And by our party today, of course, you must claim to be the only living representative of this tradition, because, you know, making yourself a homogeneous remnant party is such a great idea. At one and the same time, a revolutionary struggle involving sturdy organizations, preparation for the insurrection, and defense of the total coherence of the program and tactics, the outcome of more than 100 years of experience and lessons of the proletarian class struggle. What, 100 years of experience at succeeding at what exactly? I would really like to know. Perhaps you should list your victories here. The battle conducted by Marx, Lenin, obviously culminating in the Third Congress at Lyon and at the Sixth Enlarged Executive in Moscow, divergences would prompt the left to oppose the deviationist politics of both the International and the Gramscian, or centrist leadership of the Communist Party. The Gramscian leadership. Gramsci wasn't even in the faction that was dominant in that. In some ways, they're actually taking Togliatti's own myths and putting them back there. Of the Communist Party, originated in the fact from worrying about tactical eclecticism, which, in the name of the conquest of the masses, was diluting the classicist position of the revolutionary Marxism with the bastard ideologies of the petite bourgeoisie. This is just rhetoric. It's fairly meaningless rhetoric either, because like all Marxists throw this to all other Marxists, that their ideology is really the ideology of the petite bourgeoisie, and that we're really the ideology of the working class, even though the class origins of the people involved are almost never working class. And the ways in which these ideologies are petite bourgeoisie are rarely ever stated, although at least Trotskyists and sometimes Broder himself do state it, but their successors often do not. It becomes mere cant. So again, we can see this hardening into a more and more, we are more intransient, we're more transient, we're more homogeneous, we speak for the true revolution. Everyone else is petty bourgeois idealist, but we're not going to give our vectors of how we come to that conclusion. The concerns of the Italian left were regrettably not without foundation, and tactical errors would quickly turn into distortions of revolutionary principles. And it was quickly one step from here to open betrayal. And this one's Borges always reminded me of Trotskyist. So, where they blame this on the betrayal of the leadership. And in the case of 1925, there was a real betrayal. Like, I think that's fair. But in the case of the left in general, this idea that if they just throw things at the invariant program, I guess of the Lyon theses, because they're not actually in agreement totally with the ABCs of communism of the program of 1918-1919, we'd have to see. We have only a fragmentary record 75 years later of the discussions which took place at the Third Congress of Lyon. If not destroyed at the time, today they remain buried somewhere in Moscow, the ex-Communist Party archives. And yet, even if we have never known the context of the Lethe report given by the left's official representative or the intentions made by its delegates, we would still have the magnificent body of theses which would be presented at the conference, the left theses, a thorough knowledge of which is indispensable for every militant communist. Remaining true to the left's traditions, these theses presented at the Third Congress relegated the Italian and contingent question to the last place, while ample space was given over to the theses on the general and fundamental nature of the party. The left's theses presented at the Lyon Congresses shouldn't therefore be considered as relevant just to that particular Congress or to that particular city or year, but it should be seen as the party's doctrinal corpus defining its past, present, and future existence, even though you weren't in that party anymore after this point. I just want to point that out. The party's doctrinal corpus is defined by you when you essentially break from the party of which you are defending. Now, you did have the backing of the majority of the people, and although it doesn't matter to Bordiga because they're not Democrats in the first place, in 1925, you don't when you actually split from the other, when De Mint and Bordiga split in the 1950s when Bordiga comes back. Remaining true to the left's traditions, the reason for publishing them in English language now isn't because we want to contribute to the archive material for study of revolutionary communist movement in the 1920s, but it represents a weapon in the theoretical battle being fought today in preparation for the revolutionary battle of the future, a preparation for which you are willing to infinitely wait. It is precisely for this reason we need to take a brief and complete look at the general situation during those years before going into the question of the Italian Communist Party's Third Congress. Let's get to the actual substance of this. The hardening of the rhetoric makes it more obnoxious. With the ending of the First World War in 1918, whose raging apparition was doused in the flames of class struggle, the years of 1919 and 1920, which followed, would see the bourgeoisie trembling in terror before the revolutionary victory in Russia. I do believe that you lost in Italy and in Germany, the important places outside Russia, that they needed you to join up with them. The unexpected eruption of the revolutionary attack on the established powers, which had spread from Tsarist Russia to the whole of Europe, gave the bourgeoisie to predict the general war between the states would not usher a period of capitalist peace, but follow a renewed eruption of class struggle and civil war. Did that actually happen, though? This stage marked a huge high water mark of the international communist movement. Victory of the insurrectional battle against the swarms of petty bourgeois party, classical adversaries, and social democratic parties, classical traitors. Then military victories over the white counter-revolutionary hordes and their German Entente Cordell backers. At the same time, it marked the theoretical victory of the revolutionary Marxist doctrine, which served as the vital oxygen to enable the Bolshevik party to set on foot, and which the Bolsheviks had defended in its entirety against the ignominies of the reformists and traitors of 1914. I literally hear this from every post-Bolshevik party. While the bourgeoisie was witnessing the collapse of its own inwardly cowardly ideals, it seems to be fucking around. I don't know what you think, man. The whole position of the invariant program needed to be in a non-political position during the 1920s and 30s and up until the end of the 40s. Does seem to me like you lost. Just want to point that out to you. And saying this in 2000 is almost a fucking parody. And was trying to reshape it in the decrepit world around it, the sanctimonious formulas of Wilson and co. Boundless was our contempt, in light of our doctrine, towards the bourgeois baggage of crumbling political ideologies, towards the decrepit philosophies defeated by Marxism in its earliest days, towards its false and corrupted academic sciences, and particularly towards its hypocritical and puritanical philanthropisms. The ignorant proletarian masses without God or country put up, they very much had God and country. put up their callous fists in order to deal with a death blow to the bourgeoisie and consign the dominant class wisdom to the dustbin. Yeah, great, except they didn't win. The burning faith of those prolific years meant that it was easy to be swept along the mood of hopeful optimism, of believe that historical resurgence of the collaboration of social democratic forces, a relapse into opportunism, would be impossible under such a vigorous advance. I like how you guys seem to think that if you use more masculinist rhetoric, that you would somehow make a historical success out of a failure. This seems to be a common communist thing to, if we can just macho up our rhetoric, then we'll somehow win a victory in the past that we lost. The communist left in Italy was the first to be aware of this danger. Of course, you guys were the first, not, the Dutch German left, who were on it a little bit before you. But since they didn't sign on the Lenin's program, they can't valorize them all that much. And from then on a host of occasions, it would be the Italian party, as long, that is, as the left defined its politics, which would draw attention to the fact that neither the faith in the revolution nor the party's organizational stability would succeed in linking up the revolutionaries with the action of the working class. Party militants have to be possessed of the enthusiasm and self-assurance, but cannot be transmitted automatically to the proletarian masses merely by their activity as orators, agitators, or writers. Yeah, perhaps you should try a little bit less rhetoric and a little bit more analysis next time. Not even the executive group composed of famous leaders is capable of setting the proletarian masses into motion in pursuit of revolutionary objectives. A central thesis that we adhere to is that the revolution does not consist in choosing a group of particularly gifted people as the general staff of the party. The process is one of social physics. We observe that what is happening, we don't cause it to happen. You don't cause anything to happen. It's probably most of the history of your group. In other words, the Communist Party can, and indeed must, guide the revolution, but it can't generate it. That's fair. As years went by with the recession of revolutionary wave and the succession of proletarian defeats, finally you addressed the defeats. Again, why such hyperbolic rhetoric when you know how it's going to end? Especially after disastrous events in Germany in 1923 or in 1919, which I think is more important. There's this really big focus on 1923 and not enough focus on 1919. The Communist International failed to apply the Marxist dialectical approach to the complexities which arose from the fact that Russia and the West were at different levels of economic development and thus weren't able to respond to the various defeats and failures with a calm, sober assessment of its tactical policies. Okay, so it's material why you guys didn't see it, but it's betrayal why this happened in the first place. Which is it? Everyone's always voluntarist when they need to blame other people, but determinists when they don't need to blame themselves. Huh. Not even an executive group composed of the famous leaders is capable of setting the proletarian masses in the motion in the pursuit of revolutionary objectives. A central thesis we adhere to is that the revolution does not consist in choosing a group of particularly gifted people to the general staff of the party. Excuse me, we already went back there. I've already read that. Rose from the Russia and the West are in different levels of economic development, and thus were unable to respond to the various defeats and failures with a calm, sober assessment of its tactical policies. On the contrary, it found it easier to launch a witch hunt for right-wing deviationists, despite the fact that the culprits had been faithfully towing the party line and held up as examples until immediately before. Repeating the success of the Russian Revolution in the West, the zone of senile capitalism was thought to simply consist of imitating the Bolshevik party organization and the process of its formation, as if the revolution depended simply on organizational recipes and acts of volunteerism. Well, yeah, but then again, what are your errors in methodology quickly led to a repudiation of objectives? Be specific. As if it was not easy to maintain earlier on, because it was evident from the moment that Stalinism decreed from Russia would be one country of the proletarian dictatorship and socialism, a declaration which would involve an increasingly clear enunciation of the aim of the working towards the revolution in Europe. That's true. As Congress followed Congress, the International started to weigh up on the situation, but not in the sense that it made a realistic assessment with the view to adopting those procedures from taking action from which the World Party's revolutionary tactics should have provided for in the first place. Instead, under the pretext of trimming its sails to suit the winds of various political and social contingencies, it became prey to a dangerous mania for imposing sudden and unexpected and always disoriented changes followed by clever counter moves. This is true. I think this is fundamentally true. Although I wish, again, we were more specific. Although they were more specific in the prior introduction, so we'll give them that basis. Evidently, it was thought that the situation could be judged on month-by-month basis according to whether it was more or less revolutionary. If it was argued a shift to the left was required, left-wingers would be put in control of the parties. If instead the situation was thought to have cooled off and the opposite conclusion was reached and a shift to the right was decided upon and new elements installed in the party leadership who suited to carry out the latest policies. This is true. This is what happened. The story tale of the Comintern, after its all too brief glory years, relates to the new circumstances prompted in the search for men mostly ready to adopt, men who could be raised to the highest echelons of the party as easily as they could be cast down, unless they were opportunist enough and slimy enough to be able to adapt quickly to new changes. A practice that this denounced by us as salente a la revolute, back to front selection. But it wasn't just Stalinism which was guilty of aping the bourgeoisie's most noxious traditions of diplomatic maneuvering and parliamentarism. The fact is no part of the Communist International was immune from it. Not only did nobody denounce the suicidal method, but everybody, excluding us, including the various left opposition movements, made use of it without taking into account the fact that the method itself was dangerous symptom of the opportunist disease. I don't know. I think the councilists also condemned some of the things you did. In fact, they condemned more than you did. But okay. Even the greatest champions of the revolutionary method, as if ignorant of the fact that the world's revolutionary victories and defeats wouldn't depend on the balance of forces within the Comintern or its member parties, adopted themselves to the tactics of maneuvering and instrumental negotiations. What actually was happening, unfortunately, was exactly the opposite. The game being played on a global scale was determined by quite different power relations, with international capitalism on one side and the proletariat on the other. I mean, that's fair enough. The communist left was the only group that clearly and consistently denounced this policy as the communist left of Italy was the only group that can clearly and consistently denounce this policy as a general march in direction of neo-opportunism. New opportunism? I don't know how it's just not old opportunism. This is what we saw as the Comintern heading towards with its far from straightforward oscillations. Yes, I mean, that's fair. And we could foresee the liquidationist tendency arising out of it. Yeah, apparently you did, but so did the councilists, and they accused you of not being hard enough on it. Confronted with these tactics, he opposes swings first in the direction that, and wherever he swing to the left, made a swing to the right equally inevitable. We were more than one occasion led to make scandalous assertions that the ideas of the right, even if wrong, were often far more consistent in method and application than those of the centrists. We give an example from the Lyon Congress itself. Tasca, representing the right wing of the party at certain points in the political committee's debate, referring to Gramsci's theses, stated that, quote, I don't accept the paragraph in the political thesis in which we deny that social democracy is the right wing of the workers' movement, considering instead the left wing of the bourgeoisie. If it were so, Tasca collectively commented, the United Front tactics would be absurd because it would be a tactic of a coalition with an enemy class. By making such a statement, Tasca was worried that a justification would therefore be provided for the extreme left criticism of the United Front. It is true that the social democratic ideology is a reflection of bourgeois influence in the workers' movement. It is true that this influence, especially affecting leaders, also affects broad layers of the masses, but it hadn't yet divested the workers' movement, even where it follows social democracy, of its social class structure. This is especially true where social democracy constitutes a historical phase as an outlet of the entire workers' movement, as in the case of the English Labour Party. And if it wasn't the case, the communists joining the Labour Party would be an absurdity. And the last representative, holding Tasca's reasoning entirely logical, couldn't fail to declare that Renzi Tasca Edera is right. If the social democracy is the left wing of the bourgeoisie, you have to admit the United Front tactic is a tactic of making coalition with a bourgeois party. There is, however, a contradiction when the Renzi says about the social basis of social democracy, and he asserts about the nature of the party. If it is true that you judge a party by the social basis of its members, then social democracy is still proletarian and a revolutionary party. And this additional comment was even more relevant to Gramsci than to Tasca, where Gramsci was supporting the thesis of the party as a party of the working class. Yeah. Bordiga's left communists are very critical of workerism, I think somewhat whitely, but it leads them to weird places when we get to communization theory, which may be a deviation from left communism, but it's rooted in certain key tendencies here. The Comintern's tactical eclecticism was opposed by the Italian left from the outset, for if it did remain within the framework of the strategy whose general outlines remained unchanged up to 1923-24, it has served as a fertile terrain for the subsequent opportunistic deviations to develop, prosper, and become more pronounced and dangerous. Though the various left tendencies in international opposition movements failed, firstly, to pick up on all of this, and later were unable to assess the situation collectively. Evidence for increasingly widespread corruption and principles is not in short supply and can be summed up as follows. Finally, something more than rhetoric. The reconciliation with social democracy, both with the project to dissolve the Red International of the labor unions and subsequently merge it with the Amsterdam International, emanation of the League of Nations, and with the theorization of the left government as an intermediate stage favored by revolutionary development. The return to ambiguous formations of the United Front extended to include bourgeois parties, as in the case in Italy of the participation in the anti-fascist opposition to the Aventine secession, a bourgeois democratic, legalitarian, and pro-monarchist institution, the overarching of the left factions with the social democratic and bourgeois parties and the trade unions, the tendency to minimize to the point of erasure any distinction between the communist parties, the peasant parties, and the national democratic parties, both in the colonial areas and in the heart of Europe. I mean, I agree with 2, 3, and 4 for sure. Although the United Front from above was not excluded by Bordiga. I mean, from below was not excluded by Bordiga. They do work in trade unions. This is not the case for other left communists. The way in which the internal problems of the various parties were resolved by reshuffling their leadership, thereby adopting the most consummate democratic bourgeois methods. 6, a system of ritual humiliation and corruption, which sought to extract confessions and disavowals of past errors from miscreants, while, meanwhile, the old lags of the Russian Menshevism and international opportunism were rewarded certificates of Leninism. The International's refusal to discuss the Russian question. 5 and 7 are both legitimate too. 6, I don't know what the problem is when people come back, but this is something. Reconciliation is not something apparently that the left faction in Italy believes in. In Italy, following the Third Congress of the Italian Communist Party, the total control of the party was handed over to the centrists in 1926, and Gramsci and indeed the whole Ordinian group should share in the wholesale corruption of the correct doctrine. Okay, sure. And consequent correct revolutionary tactics, which would be the basis of Stalinism's counter-revolution. Exorbitantly, they were heading towards the worst degenerations insofar that it was a hidden agenda, which the renunciation of the European Revolution while setting out the ideal premises for the Russian Soviet to participate in the imperialist war. The rhetoric against Gramsci strengthens over time, and it's weird. It's almost like even in Italy, a lot of these people seem to believe the Togliatti line about how important Gramsci actually was, which the actual recent historical stuff, even on Bordiga himself, seems to repudiate. Anyway, I just want to point that out. Go back and see Bordiga and the Lyon thesis episodes 2, 3, and the misuses of Gramscianism episode 4 when I talk about this. And yet the various defeatist policies would have been well camouflaged if the proletariat was going to believe the International was not only not taking a backward step, but was on the contrary moving further and further to the left. As a matter of fact, a couple of years later, a tactic which would come to be referred to as social fascism would predominate. This latest change appeared to be the exact negation of the theory whose name the Gramscian centrists had fought against our position in Italy by making a merit of the fact that they faithfully executed the International's instruction. The Italian left was always held to the view, they then considered heretical, that the bourgeoisie would alternate due to the need to enforce class domination and the fascist method and the democratic method. So you go back and forth between fascism and democracy. Yet when Moscow launched its social fascism slogan, which declared that socialists had to be fought as much as the fascists because there was nothing to choose between them, wasn't it saying the same thing? I've always pointed out that authoritarianism and Bordigism sound like they're the same thing. Trotsky, now in exile, fought fiercely against a new slogan, fearing the fascist danger was gaining ground in Germany, and which the Stalinist communists were doing nothing to combat. Instead, he would back a united front tactic of 1922 variety, which aimed to create an anti-Nazi coalition. These tactics, falsely described as Leninist, Lenin backed a National Front tactic even before then. So, no, Bordigist, that's not true. They weren't falsely described as Leninist. Had always been the source of disagreement between ourselves and Trotsky, the latter only coming to see much later how they would have been abused by Stalinism. Without welcoming Moscow's new tactic as a left-wing success, we instead upheld the main trajectory of our criticism and kept alive on quite different grounds our aversion to the Popular Front coalition, completely certain that the Stalinists would return to such a formula, especially in Italy, where it had never been denounced. All this swaying back and forth has been briefly traced out, becomes a recipe for betrayal of the proletariat, even more nauseating than what occurred in 1914. The memory of the October Revolution and the glorious years preceding it would be used to support a shameless adoption of opportunist politics of class collaboration in the interest of the preservation of capitalists. I just want to tell you that the dictatorship of the proletariat and peasantry was a Lenin formulation. Just want to point that out. That deviation, that shift from the Second International policy, that shift from the language of Marx and Engels is in Lenin. Sorry. The Rome Congress in 1922, with the approval of the various theses, had given an almost unanimous ratification of the left line, which had emerged in an organic way a year earlier following the split at Leghorn. We may record by the commentary that not even Tasca's right wing had completely lined up behind the international tactic of directives at this time, some of which we have already disagreed with. The total adherence to the commentator's tactics at this time was advocated by Bombashi, the very effective Bombashi, who immediately afterwards would become an official supporter of fascism and who would later on even join them. The leadership of the Communist Party of Italy therefore appeared in 1926 at the next party congress at Lyon, had not yet been elected, and nor had the party had the opportunity to judge its worth. Instead, it had been officially nominated by the International, substituting it for one elected by due process at the Rome Congress. Now, this is totally legitimate. Even the Trotskyists would agree with this. And not only that, it had been reshuffled several times. From the time at the Rome Congress onward, the party no longer had further opportunities to pronounce on policies and actions of the leadership. During one consultation that did take place in clandestine Congress in Como in May 1924, an overwhelming majority of the decadents aligned against the policies of the new leadership to be adhering to the Rome thesis, that is, to the old left leadership. As a matter of fact, the Gramscian leadership deriving from Moscow turned out to be a minority, only with the respect to the left, but also to the right, from whom it gathered even less votes. This is absolutely true. This part of it's factual. I tend to like this when it's closer to facts and not, bloviating rhetoric. But the centrists of the Third Congress were decided that the whole epoch of the party life needed to be brought to a conclusion, and as such, uprooting the influence of the left from the party membership became a top priority for centrists in the International. This was also true in the case of Germany. Paul Levy booted out most of the Communist Party. That's how the KAPD came to be, etc. So it wasn't just the lack of unity with the Social Democrats that was a problem for the communists. It was also a lack of unity with communists, who took a line for the left than what Paul Levy wanted them to. The system, even had it managed to shift the party membership from the left to the center position, would have only succeeded in harming the party in the International because it would have been distorted and degenerated its physiognomy, lacking a back, accomplishes of Stalinist Calvin revolution in the hands of opportunism. From this disastrous way of going about things, party membership have drawn the unhappy conclusion that the Communist Party was, after all, just like all other bourgeois and social democratic parties, with every debate ending up with disagreements and antagonisms between leaders who preferred even to break up the political organization if it meant prevailing over their rivals, and thus proving those who were saying the split at Leghorn had contributed to the proletariat's ruin by allowing fascism to triumph. But as well as those workers who were already members, the party should have been concerned to attract, convince, and mobilize those for whom the International didn't represent an authority, and therefore didn't respond to calls to be disciplined by its deliberations. With its arguments and positive methods, the party should have been able to shift the workers from a position of mistrust to one of faith. I mean, but they've never done that. You haven't succeeded in doing that, like, ever. All right. Anyway, this fundamental duty of the Revolutionary Party, yes, it is, and it's one that you failed at, and also your enemies failed at. Well, all the more so for the party which flaunted the necessity of conquering the masses. The reality amongst the chattering about conquering the masses was the centrist leadership didn't succeed in enlarging its influence over the party, over the proletariat, limiting its objective to maintaining control over the proletarians who were already party members and not hesitating in order to achieve this end to break up the movement as soon as any discussion and criticism arose. I think that's true. Although a party obsessed with homogeneity can't complain about that. The Communist Party of Italy's leadership had undergone yet another reshuffle during the 5th Congress of the Communist International, during which its fusion with the PSI's Third Internationalist Group. That's the party, the Socialist Party of Italy. Immediately after the Congress, revamped leadership would issue a series of orders of the day for party functionaries to present at its federal congresses, which would signal the start of their campaign against the left. If the attack on the left political position had been conducted in the spirit of openness and sincerity, respecting the assurances given at the 5th Congress, and engaging in serious discussion, perhaps it would have shown that the leadership really had the party and its internal crisis at heart. I agree. This is a fair reply. But knowing that such an approach would deprive them of any hope of getting the party to adopt its policies, a subject which formed the substance of no few reports and dispatched the Italian executive to the Executive Committee of the Communist International, wasn't what the Onovisti wanted. They therefore opted to go down the road we have described above, the only one which would guarantee them success. And the party drank and fought organizations at the meeting of Parliament militants, the question of which political tendency best corresponded to the hard-won experiences acquired during the revolutionary struggle, whether the centrist or left, would no longer be raised. And the leadership would transform the debate amongst the party's Third Congress into a slanderous campaign against the left, which would be characterized as fractious and secessionist. During the Congress, the delegate would reveal that, quote, the party's Congress preliminary debate consisted of insults and muckraking. It wasn't a debate about ideological issues, unquote. On May 25th, 1925, La Unida, Unity, had announced the party's Third Congress would be taking place soon. The left called for discussions to commence immediately, and since presidential restrictions and disciplinary measures of a fractious nature would be of no advantage to the revolutionary movement as a whole and would only poison the Congress atmosphere, they called for the measures to be suspended. Therefore, with the aim of creating an information network, not of secret but open to the entire party membership, the left have formed the Entente Committee. And in the letter of June 1st, informed the Communist Party of Italy's executive of the committee's existence. In short, the Entente Committee urged, quote, that there be sufficient time allowed for debates, such as to take into account the unprepared state of the party masses and the importance of the matter under consideration, that the provincial congresses be held only after the exhaustive discussion of the party press, that the federal congresses, it be possible to debate the views of the recognized comrades at the various currents, the nomination of delegates to the party congress take place at their respective federal congresses, and in the case, however, the nomination are made by other means, the authority to choose members of the eventual committee to be entrusted to the official representatives of the various currents, the right to nominate and discipline speakers who will be explaining the thought of this or that current to the Congress be fully recognized. It can be seen that the document contained nothing of the ordinary, nothing to justify accusations of fractionalism. There was just the proposal during which the pre-Congress discussions and the Congress itself, there be room for ideas to be freely expressed. However, Unity published the left document on June 7th. The executive revealed that 2 other faction-ish documents have been intercepted by the party in April and June. Clear proof commended the executive of the fractious activity and secret into the bargain, which was carried within the germ of a split in the party. Signatories of this document were immediately dismissed from their posts within the organization and threatened with expulsion. To give us an idea of the climate of the real terror, which, along the lines of prevailing Stalinism, had established itself in Italy, and during the period of fascist dictatorship to boot, we quote from the top secret circular sent out in the interregional officials. Here they were instructed to immediately get rid of those who were attempting to splinter the party's forces and to change it into a disguised social democratic party. The top secret circular, which went into the following practical instructions: the left fraction's national committee takes advantage of the work of some travelers in order to establish links with various federations. You need to arrange In the case of these people arriving at our branches, are you meeting them in the course of your travels, that having obtained help from their local comrades, that both they and their dwellings are immediately searched? All fractionalist material that can be found on them, circulars, addresses, letters, etc., must be sent to us. Naturally, by engaging in this party police work, you will need to state to those concerned that you are executing a definitive preemptory instruction issued by Executive Committee. Shortly after the Entente Committee was resolved with the approval of the International's representative, anybody who didn't abide by this order was threatened with expulsion. Although Hobart-Droz promised a complete freedom of ideological debate during the party talks, the left had no qualms about defining the voting procedures as Gilotti, one of the liberalism and post-war democracy's most illustrious figures, formed a coalition with Mussolini in 1921's election, which allowed the fascists to enter the parliament. The Giolottian method, to which the left referred to one used by the democratic leader to ensure constant victories in elections, and consists of gathering a broad consensus, both with the help of the mafia organizations and aided by the Squadra Mezzanine, financed directly by political supporters, a kind of front order of fascist squadism. It is therefore entirely predictable that rather than an ideological conflict between the two party tendencies, instead a suffocating alternative between division and unity, fraction and discipline would form the backdrop of the Communist Party of Italy's Third Congress. The Executive Committee of the International released its attack on the Italian left in April 1925, with the Fifth and Large Executive approved a resolution on the Italian question, which stated, quote, "Today it is clear that the Borges ideology constitutes a principal obstacle to the party's Bolshevization. Therefore, the maximum effort must be directed toward the elimination of this obstacle." Unquote. No indication of the duties and tactical tasks that the party should set itself to was to be found in this resolution. It consisted solely of an attack on an ideology of the Italian left, as defined as a byproduct of the Second International, and in conflict with Leninism on three fundamental issues. First, abstentionism, the party's role and the party's tactics. Well, the abstentionism thing was made clear by Lenin, but nonetheless. The Italian left, we read in this document, could still be characterized as a parliamentary abstentionist despite dropping the policy of the Second Congress. Yep, true, they did, even though they weren't happy about it. This characteristic feature would drive the party into a state of political inertia because it involved a rejection of the need to conquer the masses. It would bind it to the nature of the fascist phenomenon, and finally, it would ossify its tactics. In contrast with Leninism, which represented flexible tactics, constantly adapting to the world's changing economic and political situation, ready to speedily adapt its slogans and attitudes to stay in contact with the masses. I do think the focus on the masses ends up being a problem, because it's very ill-defined. On September 4th, the Commenters Executive Committee would send a letter to the direction of the Communist Party of Italy, published in Unity, and October 7th, reiterating and enlarging upon all the accusations already leveled against the Italian left. There are two characteristic positions on the anti-fascist struggle and on the conception of the party, which we now find being openly stated, which already gave a premonition to the Stalinist counter-revolution, and yet, irony of ironies, the document was written by those who would later become victims of Stalinism itself. The left has stated on numerous occasions why it considered fascism unfortunate was above all because it had breathed life due to the train of its violence and persecutions in the legalist and democratic anti-fascist movement. This was why the left considered it appropriate to attack democracy and social democracy with the same degree of force as it had attacked fascism. It had been democracy and social democracy which had generated, nurtured, and provided support to the fascist movement. The left had unceasingly unmasked the complicity and class nature of those so-called oppositionists who proposed legal and constitutional methods. The clear classist position was derived and condemned by the Communist International, which was now desperately in search of immediate successes, whether real or imaginary. They accused the left of immediately carrying out, quote, an analysis of various social strata which formed the basis of fascism, of their interests and their differences. The left was held to blame for not warning the social democratic or left-wing bourgeoisie governments and the fascist government were not one and the same. And therefore the party, not wanting to appear to the proletariat as though it were, quote, maintaining fascism in power if it had the possibility of getting the Aventine parliament to replace it, should have been intervene with its electoral forces in favor of one or the other bourgeois adversaries. This bogus problem, so dear to the hearts of the renegades of every stamp, was resolved into a masterly way by the left in the Lyon theses. Here they would demonstrate that fascism was no different from democracy, since both were rooted in the same social class, and above all articulated, genetic fallacies, the less favorite fallacy, and above all articulated the interests of the same social class of bourgeoisie. The fascist movement was best understood purely and simply as an attempt with cavalry revolutionary aim in view to have a political unification with the conflicting interests of the various bourgeois political groupings. Incidentally, we shouldn't forget that the Mussolinian fascism would never have come about in the first place, and Mussolini would have probably continued to militate inside the Italian Socialist Party if that party had supported the war like all the other National Socialist parties in the Second International. It was a strong presence of the left inside the party which had prevented the Italian... the American party didn't support the war. They were in the International, but whatever. Just getting your facts right, guys. It was a strong presence of the left inside the party which had prevented the Italian socialists from becoming to the complete betrayal perpetuated by social democracy, bearing rare exceptions, in other countries. Fascism, an interventionist and democratic movement, was born in 1914 as a reaction to the left's classist and revolutionary approach, and it would be financed by the Entente via supporters of the French Socialist Party. In 1922, it would take power legally with the support of all the democratic parties in alliance with the forces of Italian social democracy. In fact, from a bourgeois legalistic standpoint, the fascist regime was a legitimate leader of the Italy through the 20s. On the basis of the left's rigorous analysis wasn't opinions, but a definite material and social formulations, and the authors of the international documents therefore had to, somehow or other, settle accounts with it. They would solve this problem in the classic way opportunists have always sought to solve it, by distinguishing between program and tactics, between theory and practice. So there's no distinction between theory and praxis in this thought. Okay. Quote, looked up from the general perspective of historical development, wrote the Executive Committee of the Communist International, socialists are linked to fascism. They would have proved this by their general attitude towards fascism from the electoral truce signed by the Socialist and Fascist Party right up to the recent declarations in the fascist newspaper by De Aragona and Baldesti, which proves a year after Matteone's assassination, the social reformist leaders were seeking grounds for collaboration and understanding with fascism and deplored the hostility harbored by the working classes against it. The socialists and the maximalists are linked to fascism by their defense of the capitalist order and the capitalist interests against the proletarian revolution. Asterisk, remember, Mussolini was a maximalist first. Considered from the general historical perspective, therefore, form a left wing of fascism. Our party's tactics, however, whilst not losing sight of the general perspective, cannot, in its day-to-day activity, neglect the essential differences between the bourgeois' various currents, so they can be pitted against each other, and their influence amongst the momentarily disoriented working masses uprooted. The left, quote, since it only could see and continue the text, the general perspective hadn't understood tactically that the party must utilize conflicts which exist within the bourgeoisie's and fascism's own camps. These were the blasphemies which the Communist International, not yet counter-revolutionary, had ended up formulating. These were the blasphemies which Gramsci and his group would repeat in Italy, and these were the blasphemies which serve as a theoretical basis for the whole counter-revolutionary work of embracing democracy. Something that all of the internationals had done, including the first and also the SPD, when Marx and Engels were alive, etc., etc. The appear to reasonable fascists included, which would find its highest expression in partisan coalitions and still to this day keeps the proletariat clinging to bourgeois democracy. The United Front was therefore no longer considered a tactical instrument for unmasking the betrayal of the social democratic leaders and uprooting their influence from the working masses, but a means of exerting pressure in order to tip the scales this way or that in favor of one or another of the various conflicting groups within the bourgeoisie. The other point on which the International would base its criticism was the conception of the party and party organization. Its left platform, the left has stated, quote, the party is the organ that synthesizes and brings together the various individual and group initiatives provoking a class struggle. Such a party organization must be capable of placing itself above particular categories, therefore enabling it to draw from synthesis elements deriving from the various sections of the proletariat, from amongst the peasantry, and from amongst deserters from the bourgeois class, etc., etc. This is pretty clearly implied in the manifesto. I'm just going to point that out. These formulation, which so scandalized the Italian leadership, would provoke the same reaction amongst the Comintern leaders who, eventually in a slightly more serious vein than their Italian epicons, were keen to detect it in the indubitable symptoms of Menshevism. Quote, if the social composition made room for deserters from the bourgeoisie, the Moscow executive wrote, it would be extremely perilous. I mean, deserters from the bourgeoisie is what Engels was. As for the Italian centrists, they would simply accuse the left of wanting to transform the party into an interclass organization, a synthesis of interests that absolutely impossible to synthesize. Unity, 1925. Yeah, that I'm gonna agree with the Bordigas on this one. That's bullshit. And there's an honest campaign against the left. The centrists weren't interested in refuting their positions on doctrinal and tactical grounds. They didn't put their theses against the left, but resting to securing the position of the monopolizers of the party's means of information and executive organs, they waged war using the most blatant distortions and degregations. Very often, their articles were peppered with phrases such as the following, quote, "It's a massive errors, rather ridiculous statements," unquote. "It's a load of rubbish lacking in common sense and theoretical perspective," unquote. "A fargo of commonplaces spiced up with considerable dose of bad faith, charlatanry, and demagoguery," unquote, quote. Yeah, perhaps people should lay off the rhetoric a bit. The prediction that the individual deserters from the bourgeois class would continue as to the past to side with the revolution and join the Communist Party was certainly no new discovery of the Italian left. Nope, as I said, I agree that it's in the manifesto. Neither was it prompted by a lack of confidence in the working class or a pro-Bolshevik stance. It was Marx, and it was, who had declared that, quote, "As in former times when the nobility went over to the side of the bourgeoisie, now part of the bourgeoisie sides with the proletariat, particularly some bourgeois ideologists who have arrived at an understanding of the historical movement as a whole." I mean, Engels. The Gramscian position in this regard was that the party, as understood by the left, would have to be fine in Marx and Engels' day when, quote, "it was restricted to registering working class advantage and undertaking propaganda work." But this was definitively not the case in the age of Leninism when, quote, "the party leads the masses, directs the class struggle, and doesn't restrict itself to acting as public notary." Poor Karl Marx demoted to being a notary by Stalin's epigons. With the matter as they stand, the centrists continued, intellectuals can no longer play any role in the Communist Party, which the proletarian party composed of proletarians, except they weren't, as we've already talked about. If it had been a matter of serious confrontation of ideas between the centrist tendency headed by Gramsci and the left, it would have been easy to reply to their criticism by pointing out that neither Gramsci, Terracini, Togliatti, Scaramaro, nor Tasca, along with the vast majority of the party leaders, were proletarians. I mean, neither was Bordiga. And figures in hand, we could equally have shown that from 1923 onwards, the Ordovist leadership, with a number of workers in leadership roles, both at the summit of the party and at the local level, had considerably fallen compared to before. Yep, this is probably the case. The question of safeguarding the party from opportunist menace certainly wasn't anything to do with ensuring a numerical proletarian hegemony inside the party by boycotting intellectuals, much less by Bolshevizing it. The solution lay elsewhere, and it would be collectively expounded by the left at the International Six Enlarged Executive. Quote, "We will be told that what we are asking for is all right-wing elements are asking for as well, that we weren't territorial organization in whose assemblies our entire discussion is dominated by intellectuals and their long speeches. But the danger of demagoguery and being deceived by leaders will always exist, and it has existed since the proletarian party first arose. Yet neither Marx nor Lenin, who both dealt with the problem in depth, ever thought of resolving it through a boycott of intellectuals or non-proletarians. On the contrary, they constantly emphasized the historical necessary role of deserters from the dominant class in the revolution. It is well known that general opportunism and treachery infiltrate the party and the masses via certain leaders. But the struggle against the danger must be conducted by other means. Even if the working class could manage without their leaders, agitators, journalists, etc., it would have no option but to go and find them within the workers' ranks. However, the risk of these workers become leaders giving in to corruption and demagoguery is no different than that from intellectuals giving in to corruption and demagoguery. I totally agree with this. This is absolutely completely true. As everybody knows, in some cases have been precisely ex-workers who have played the dirtiest role in the workers' movement. And finally, hadn't the intellectuals' role been eliminated anyway by the factory sale organizations as practiced today? Yeah, the factory sale organizations were a disaster. Quite the reverse is true. Intellectuals, along with ex-workers, make up the party apparatus. The social role of these elements hadn't changed, and that, in fact, has become more dangerous still. If we admit that these elements may not be corrupted by the official status, the difficulty remains because we have given them positions with a lot more responsibility than in the past. In the small factory council meetings, the workers had, in practice, very little freedom of movement. They did not have enough members for their class instinct to influence the party. We are warning about, therefore, is not the danger of reduction in influence of intellectuals, but on the contrary, the fact that the workers in the factory cells are interested only in their immediate needs within their particular firm, and they are unable to see the wider problems of the general revolutionary development of their class. Unity, July 7th, 1925. Let's stop here. We've been going for a little while. We'll finish this in part 9. Like and subscribe, hit the bell, and leave a comment. I know I was mean in the beginning of this. I get really annoyed by this highfalutin rhetoric that seems to be not justified, but as we get into the historical discussion, I do find this text more rich than I initially thought. This 2000 text. We just had to get the historical discussion where we get specific instead of these general rhetorical denunciations, which all communist oppositionist groups to all other groups that they disagree with. It's kind of a rhetoric of hyperbole that we all have to deal with. All right, and on that note, we'll finish this up soon and then get to the actual text.